Okay, calm down.
As you were about to, I believe, talk about the labor disputes.
Yeah, and it's funny actually. This also kind of connects to what we were saying about censorship because kind of the story that I was looking into culminates with a massive gag order where no one is allowed to speak in favor of a strike. But this this dispute over the railway workers and the terms of their labor, I think, is so significant, and it's a convergence of several really long-standing processes that also go back to the 19th century. And on one of them is simply the struggle to control labor on the railways, which is still, even today, even the 21st century, is the backbone of the material economy. It's how raw materials and finished goods, consumer goods, are moved to markets, and it's still critical and it's still profitable. The rail companies are making plenty of profit. And then also on the other hand, the sort of cycle that you can see in struggles between labor, employers, and the state in times of crisis. So we're still really coming out of the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdowns. And in a lot of ways, this averted strike, right? This strike that wasn't allowed to happen this year. It is an echo of the strike in 1922, exactly 100 years ago, which was over a lot of similar issues. It was over pay and also safety conditions on the rails. And the echoes are amazing. So, for one thing, it was coming out of the crisis of the First World War and the Spanish flu. So, you had this situation where the labor force had been reduced, and those who were still working had gone through terrible conditions. They had uh, more and more burden of work being placed on them, as so many of their colleagues either died or were incapacitated by the war or the flu, or simply retired, couldn't keep working. And so the workload was getting greater, the risk, the harm was tremendous, and the pay was being cut effectively because there was inflation. And so all of these things are really similar. And that strike did happen, but it ended up failing partly because the media and the rail companies basically they accused the strikers of being communists and radicals of various kinds, and also they accused them of being the cause of inflation. Right? They blamed inflation on the unions. It's because these workers want to be paid too much that prices are going up. And these were pretty effective PR lines for the employers and the government and the big newspapers. And so that strike didn't last. But it's remarkable. I think you can see a sort of progression here where with COVID-19, there's sort of been a similar crisis, right? Where workers are under strain, they're having to do extra work, they're having to take on new duties at the same time that a lot of them are ill and can't go to work. And the basically the this time they couldn't strike because there was a legal precedent in place from a Supreme Court ruling from World War I saying that if Congress wants to, they can just step in and force rail workers to keep working because the rails are critical to the whole economy. That means that it falls under the interstate commerce clause, that the federal government can just say, well, because a rail strike would be bad for interstate commerce, we can just force you to keep working under whatever contract we decree, right? So in this way, you could say the situation has gone a step further. It's like now they're not even allowing it to get to the point of a strike. And they're basically saying, no, you're not going to get what you want. We're just going to force you to accept this contract. So that was the first thing I looked into, was just this incredible echo of 2022 and 1922, right? Both of them sort of crises of labor after basically after a pandemic, right? In the recovery coming from a pandemic. But even further than that, I mean, if you want to go back even further, the rails have always been this kind of critical crucible of of work and the control of workers, right? And this is why I think there's so much precedent that's built up where basically more or less the state says, we're just going to make you work, don't try to walk off. And it's not just because the rails are critical economically, it's also because if the rails stop functioning, that can lead to a spiraling crisis, right? Where now you're at warehouses or factories where the goods aren't coming in. What are those workers going to do? They're probably going to strike too. They're going to walk out. If they don't get paid, they're going to walk out. And it can become a rolling, a general strike, right? That's more or less what can result because the rails are in this crucial sort of central role. And that's why I think the state and elites have always been hyper conscious that we can't let a rail strike happen. This is like the big threat. This could mushroom out of control. And they've always known that, at least you'd have to say at least since 1877, which was when the first national strike happened. And it was totally spontaneous and unplanned. And it started because the B&O Railroad, in a time of relative depression, there was a bit of a depression in the mid 1870s. The B&O Railroad cut their workers' wages by 10%. And so the rail workers in West Virginia on the B&O Railroad walked out and started marching, and it just spread along the rails. So then suddenly the roundhouse and station workers in Baltimore were walking out and picketing. And then Philadelphia, New York, Pittsburgh, and it went west, Chicago, St. Louis, within a week, within a matter of just a few days. And this is the thing, with the rails, the workers are moving and they're communicating with each other. And one action, it's like dominoes. And within about 2 weeks, it was in San Francisco, all the way on the West Coast. And the state governors were panicked. The governor of Maryland called in the National Guard from different parts of the state to go into Baltimore and basically force the workers at gunpoint back into the roundhouse to get the trains running again. And the president Hayes called in. He actually, when it really mushroomed in Chicago, that's probably where it was biggest, right at that hub in the middle of the country. The president called in 4 military units out of the Indian wars that were going on in the Dakota Territory into Chicago to break up the crowds and force the workers back to work in Chicago. So this was seen, and newspapers said it all happened so quickly and so cataclysmically with no forewarning. Maybe if you were a worker, you could sense that something like this was going to happen. But to the elite, it all just exploded out of nowhere. And they said this isn't just a strike, this is a labor revolution. In their perception, this was a revolutionary situation. Society was about to be overturned. And it took guns basically to get the workers to stop rioting, to clear the streets. 45 people in total were killed in the violence, most of them workers. And it only lasted a few weeks. It basically was just in July 1877. And, you know, it was not very organized. It just happened spontaneously. But it was like a huge warning shot, right? Everyone in the country could now see what had happened, which is that the whole national economy had been woven together by the rails, and the rail workers kind of held that choke point in their hands. If they decided to shut everything down, they could. And that's I think the main reason why from then on the state and business have always agreed in saying we have to keep the rails running. We can't let unrest or resistance break out on the railways. That could be a disaster that will explode out of control. And that was the mindset they had then going into the First World War. And when they briefly nationalized the rails, just sort of seized them as government operations for several years in World War One, and then gave them back to business afterwards. And that then led to the 1922 strike.